What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FCP here. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be installing this radiator on this F30 328i behind us. This is going to be an N20 powered car, hence why the radiator has this silvery finish as opposed to black finish. If this was an N26 car, it would have a sensor on the radiator which is for detecting ozone. So the SULEV N26 and the non-SULEV N20 have different radiators specifically for the emissions compliance. However, that is the only main difference. So if you do have an N26 vehicle, this would pretty much be the same process minus that one sensor, but it is worth mentioning that there are two different radiators for both of those engines. Should be a pretty straightforward process. Really, in this case, we're going to be installing this Nissan's OE replacement radiator. Pretty straightforward. As you can see, it is a very tiny radiator, very short, so not going to be that involved to get in there. But also, while we're in there, we're going to be draining out the coolant and replacing it with this genuine BMW coolant. This is the blue stuff, the G48. BMW does have a green coolant antifreeze now, but that's probably not going to apply to any of the F30 models. In most cases, you are only going to have blue coolant in those systems. So genuine BMW coolant's recommendation there. But with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need in order to do this job, and we'll go ahead and get into it. So some of the tools you're going to need to do a radiator replacement on an F30 328. To remove the splash shield, you're going to want an 8mm socket. It's mostly 8mm self-tapping screws, and then there's also a plate underneath that requires 8mm socket as well, unless it's an X-Drive car, which that reinforcement plate will be 13mm instead. So there's a little bit of a variance between the shape of the subframe and the parts that are on there. So 8mm for rear-wheel drive cars, 8mm and 13mm for X-Drive cars. You're going to want a T25 torque socket. You're going to want a hose pick like this in order to remove the lower water pump hose in order to drain most of the coolant out of the system. Another pick for releasing the locking tabs for the quick disconnect fittings that are on the radiator inlets or outlets. Flathead screwdriver or hose clamp removal tools. In this case, 6 and 7mm is required for most of those hoses, but a flathead screwdriver will also work as well. And if you have access to a power filler, so a vacuum filler, that's going to make the filling and bleeding procedure a little bit easier on this car, but you can still fill it manually. This just makes it a little bit easier. And since you're going to be working underneath the vehicle, you're probably going to want a light. A couple of dark areas there, so a light is going to be super helpful. And if you can have an impact driver with that 8mm, it's going to make removal of that splash shield a little bit quicker as well. But as you can see, super basic in the hand tools department, pretty much common stuff that you're going to come across while working on most vehicles. And now that we talked about some of the tools we're going to need, let's go and get into it. So first thing we need to do is we need to remove the airbox, which sits right here between the front clip of the engine and the engine itself. So we have our hood release cable, which sits on the airbox. We're going to remove that. After we have our hood release cable out of the way, we're going to remove our mass airflow sensor connector and push this out of the way. And then we have a 6mm hose clamp down here. You can also use the flathead screwdriver. And from there, we should be able to pull the airbox out. So it's just held in place with these grommets. So you just want to pull up, make sure they clear. And there's our airbox out of the way. So at this point, you can remove this lower silencer for the intake. It's one more hose clamp down here, and then we have one of the expansion tank hoses secured to the bottom of it. So now we have the airbox and the airbox silencer out of the way. We also now need to remove the fan. Fan is held in with a T25 self-tapping screw over here. It actually physically threads into the radiator itself. And then over here we have another T25 fastener that holds the oil cooler to the fan. So we need to remove both those T25 screws. So at this point, our transmission oil cooler is loose. There is a bracket that does hold it down here in position, so we're gonna have to do a little bit of wiggling from underneath. Next, we have our electrical connector for our fan. So we have our wiring lead here. It's held in with a little rivet style clamp. So I'm just going to pull this out of the fan shroud like so. Kind of give you a little bit more room to work with in terms of getting to this connector. Just 2 tabs. Should depress those and the connector should come off. So these are 2 tabs right here that you have to press on to release. So I actually just pressed on the tabs while lifting up on the wiring lead with my thumb. Popped right off, so we'll put that off to the side. From this point, the fan shroud is relatively loose, but we still have the oil cooler over here, kind of in the way. Like I said, there's a bracket that it sits on, so want to make sure that this is out of the way before we try to pull the fan up. Also, there's a locating tab on the bottom of the fan that goes into a carrier, so I have to remove the splash shield to gain access to that, and you need to remove the splash shield anyway because the only way to drain this engine out and the radiator is to remove some of the coolant hoses, so we're going to be draining from underneath. So at this point, we'll lift the car up in the air and remove the splash shield from underneath the car. Next up, we're going to remove our splash shield. It's held on by a bunch of 8mm self-tapping screws, a whole bunch of them, so you need to remove all of them in order to drop this whole panel. Now we also have the secondary splash shield here, which is for the steering rack, held in by the same 8mm fasteners. So now we unhook some of these smaller hoses from the oil cooler assembly. This is for the transmission. We need to pull up on it in the direction of travel of fan removal. There is going to be a little tang on the back side of the oil cooler, and that's kind of what holds it to the fan. So you have to get up high enough to get past the tang to be able to push it forward. There we go. So that little metal tab that you see there on the cooler, that physically slides into a notch on the radiator fan, which is right here. So the entire cooler assembly is basically secured to the fan shroud right there. And you have to pull this assembly up far enough to get past that little tab and to get it out of the way. You can't pull the radiator unless that's out of the way. And now the transmission oil cooler is off to the side. We need to start the somewhat delicate process of lifting the radiator fan up and out of the way. You just want to make sure it doesn't get caught in anything and that you're not pulling anything important up at the same time. So there's a little tab here on the left-hand side of this fan shroud. You actually have to pull this at an angle. This tab has to clear this upper radiator neck. On the upper radiator neck, there's actually a flat section. So you need to make sure that as you're pulling the fan, you have to come up kind of at an angle for this to clear that upper radiator neck. So it's a little finicky. Just make sure that nothing is stuck on the fan shroud and make sure that you clear the upper radiator neck and it should come out. So now that we have everything out of the way, we need to remove this hose on the front of the water pump. The water pump is the lowest point in the cooling system, so we do have to drain from there. The only inconvenient part about that is the electric power steering assist motor, since this is an electric power steering car, is conveniently directly below the main point in which you drain the engine coolant. So we're using a 6mm hose clamp driver. Gonna loosen up this hose clamp and peel it back. There we go. And I'm gonna use a hose pick to come in here, break the seal on this hose and slowly drain out the coolant. There's not a ton of capacity in the radiator since it is a relatively small radiator on this engine. Most of the coolant is gonna be draining out. It's gonna be radiator, expansion tank, pretty much anything in any of these coolant lines. This is the lowest point, and possibly some of the coolant in the engine will also come out as well. So getting a good capacity of the coolant out. So technically replacing the radiator, you're also doing a cooling system service by changing out the antifreeze and putting new in. So now that we've drained a good portion of the coolant, I'm just gonna leave this radiator hose loose. I'm also gonna wipe down the power steering motor. Really hate the fact that this is the only option we have to drain. But it kind of is what it is. So I'm gonna try to wipe this down as much as possible, get all the coolant off of it, and then we're gonna go ahead and lower the car back down and start removing the radiator. Next up, we're gonna remove these two T25 screws. These kind of hold the sandwich plate at the top, helps retain the top of the radiator. So I'm gonna loosen those up. And so removing those screws, it gives us complete access to the top of the radiator in order to be able to pull it out. Next step, I'm gonna remove the upper lower radiator hoses. These are a quick disconnect style. So just a matter of pulling up the lock ring and then pulling the hose off. It is our general recommendation to replace the upper and lower radiator hoses when removing them because there's an O-ring that creates the seal inside. And generally what happens over time is that those O-rings, they basically flatten and they become very dry and they shrink. What will sometimes happen is when you go to reinstall those hoses back onto a new radiator is it won't create an airtight seal and it'll leak a little bit. So you need to be really kind of aware and careful with that. So definitely, I'd say definitely have the upper and lower radiator hoses on hand. Whether you need them or not, that's up to you. But we just have seen that as a problem from time to time on these as they age. So you can see what kind of seal these radiator hoses have on those quick disconnect fittings. It took quite a bit of force to get that one to finally release. And just to mess with you, this lower hose here, they had to put the quick disconnect fitting upside down just to make it interesting. This is a smaller hose. Hopefully it cooperates a little bit better than those bigger hoses did. I think one thing you'll come to realize on this job is there really is not a very clean way of doing this. The way that this entire cooling system is designed, no drain plug on the radiator, water pump is the lowest accessible point to drain from. And obviously with how high this lower radiator neck is, that's about half of the radiator. So there's always gonna be more coolant down here that does not drain out, strictly because the lower radiator hose comes up here to the thermostat. Now we have our fourth hose with the retaining ring also upside down, just to add hilarity. This is one of the hoses that goes to our oil cooler here for the transmission. So obviously all the space in the world to work with. Just have to get on the lock for it and pull it down, and we should just be able to pull the hose out. Because of the horrific placement of this transmission to oil cooler line to the radiator, I'm actually just going to release it from up here at the oil cooler itself, because there's simply no way to easily get a pick onto that lower one and actually remove it. Don't see how it's possible, so I'm going to remove it from here, and then we'll reinstall the line onto the new radiator. Since the quick disconnect is upside down there as well. So we're going to remove our retainer up at the top, just slides out. And from this point, we should be able to pull the radiator out. And of course, more coolant's gonna leak out of it because there's still some left over in it. Yep. So here's our new radiator. Like we said earlier, it's a Nissan's replacement, so it's an OE design. Has all of the factory quick disconnect style male fittings on them. So works with all of the factory hoses. There's no modification that's required. So first thing we're gonna do is reinstall this lower line here. This was for the auto trans cooler. Go ahead and lock that into place. It's doing that now because it's gonna be the easiest time to reinstall it. And now you have to slide the radiator back down into place without damaging the fins, which is gonna be a little bit of a delicate process because we do have the trans cooler still sitting here. So just gonna take this one slow and bring it down. Have the radiator dropped into position. We can start reattaching a lot of our hoses here. You wanna make sure that we re-secure our trans cooler hose from the bottom of the radiator. There we go. So we're good on that front. Next, we'll reinstall this top support, which locks everything in place. We'll take two of these self-tapping T25s, and we're gonna run them back into this top mount here. These holes are not threaded from the factory, hence why they're self-tapping screws. They'll make their own threads. Just make sure that they start straight, and they'll thread right in. So now we've reattached all the coolant lines. We're gonna go ahead and drop our radiator fan back in place. And key here is to slide it down. You wanna make sure that it's particularly on the transmission cooler, doesn't grab the transmission cooler on the way down. So not without struggle, the radiator fan dropped in place. The most important thing here is making sure that the inner portion of the radiator fan, it is in between the end tanks on the radiator. As long as you have that lined up, it should slide into place. And like I said, make sure nothing's getting trapped, particularly where the transmission oil cooler is. So next up is the transmission cooler back into position. So next up, we're just going to lock this part of the upper radiator hose back into position. This locking tab, it's basically spring loaded, which is kind of cool. So next up, we're going to slip the hose here onto the water pump. And I'm going to reposition the hose clamp slightly so that it's in a slightly easier position to get to in the future. So we're going to reinstall the other two T25s from before. One of them secures the fan shroud back onto the radiator. Again, self-tapping screws is going to cut his own threads, and then we also have the T25 here for the oil cooler. That goes directly into the fan shroud. That already has threads pre-cut from before. And then from there, we'll go ahead and plug the fan back in. Clicked into place. A little push rivet for the wiring harness goes into place. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to vacuum fill the cooling system and then run the self-bleeding procedure that the vehicle has. We have a quick tech tip video that shows you how to activate the automatic bleeding system on these cars. So we'll go ahead and throw a card for you to click if you want to see that. But really at this point, it's just a matter of refilling the cooling system, running the self-bleeding procedure, checking for leaks while we do that. And then once we verify that everything is good, we can button everything back up. All right, so at this point, walked off camera to do our 50-50 mix of antifreeze and still holding 25 inches of vacuum. It's holding steady, so reasonably safe to assume there's no leaks in the system. And that, the system, they're gonna vacuum, it should be able to hold pressure. As you see, when we pulled vacuum, all of the hoses collapsed, which is pretty cool. And at this point, we're just gonna go ahead and vacuum fill the system. So we have a more detailed video on how to do this, but I'm gonna initiate the vehicle self-bleeding procedure since it has the electric water pump. Just gonna turn the vehicle on into accessory mode. So not running, but just on. We're gonna crank our heat, full blast. Fan setting, we're gonna set down to the lowest. And from here, we're just gonna hit the accelerator pedal for 10 seconds and it should kick on. So after our self-bleeding procedure, the level in the expansion tank dropped a little bit, to be expected. So I'm just gonna go ahead and fill it up to the max cold line located here on the front of the expansion tank. We'll go ahead and put the expansion tank cap back on, and really at this point we just need to reinstall the lower portion of the airbox here, the silencer, and install the airbox. Put the splash shield back on the bottom, and we're all set. So we're gonna go ahead and slide this silencer here onto the bottom. There's some alignment tabs that you have to kind of be aware of when you're putting this in place. And once those are lined up, push it together, and we'll go ahead and tighten our hose clamp. Before we do that, we also want to make sure that our little Got this little thing for our hose down here. We're gonna go ahead and push that back on. We're gonna go ahead and drop our airbox back onto the inlet hose for the turbo. And there's also this area over here, which is for fresh air. Picks up somewhere in front of here in the bumper. Notice how it has these two notches on it? Well, it just slides right down into place, which makes it super convenient. So you just slide it down onto the air duct over here, and then we'll just go ahead and push it into place. Take our fresh air hose here, slide that up. Go ahead and tighten the hose clamp next, which is a 6mm. I'm gonna take our hood release cable, put it back into the holders here on top of the airbox like so. And then we'll go ahead and reconnect our mass airflow sensor. Just clicks into place. So we're gonna go ahead and reinstall this forward splash shield, I guess if you want to call it that, for the power steering motor. And then our piece de resistance, Big Bertha. On these splash shields, these big ones particularly, helps if you have somebody helping you. Alternatively, if you can get the front hooked, that'll usually help you get the rest into position. So as you can see, replacing the radiator on your F30 328 is really not that bad. Not too many tools are required. I'd say the only tricky part is the two lower hoses that go into the lower portion of the radiator. The quick disconnects being mounted upside down, which really makes absolutely no sense. Just makes the job a little bit more difficult. And also be really careful when you're moving that transmission to oil cooler if you have an automatic equipped transmission, because you do have to pull it up and you have to get it past a certain point on that fan shroud in order to get it to move out of the way. And also removing the fan itself could be a little bit tricky just because of how it has to come out and the way that it needs to go back in. Just be really careful with how you deal with those. But other than that, it is pretty straightforward. There's lots of room to work with. And I'd say just be careful when you're draining the coolant out of the car, strictly because there is no easy way to do it. And it's gonna be a little bit messy, so just make sure that you take precaution on that. But other than that, very straightforward. And obviously the vehicle self-bleeding makes getting all the air bubbles out of the cooling system after you refill super easy. It's pretty much a set it and forget it type of operation, which is the one nice thing about working on these external water pump cars. So with that said, we hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. Hit that like button. Also hit subscribe. We've got plenty more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.